The dust of the Wyoming Trail tastes like broken promises. You travel 1,000 miles on a bone-rattling train, trading everything you know for a man you've never met, only to hear him say, "You aren't enough." That you're too small, too fragile, left on a splintering train depot platform, with nothing but a leather trunk and a shrinking shadow. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the frontier. And survival out here doesn't care about the size of your bones. It cares about the iron in your spine. The locomotive bled steam over the warped floorboards of the platform. The hiss sounded like a dying breath in the oppressive heat of a late August afternoon. Callie Higgins stood perfectly still. If she moved, she feared her legs would give out. 3 days of riding in a soot-choked rail car, surviving on stale bread and tepid water, had stripped away the last of her Chicago pallor. Now she was covered in a fine layer of grey ash. She gripped the leather handle of her trunk. It was the only anchor keeping her from blowing away. Oak Haven was less a town and more a suggestion of civilization. A single dirt thoroughfare carved through the yellow prairie grass, flanked by false front buildings that looked as exhausted as the people walking between them. There were no trees, just sky. Too much sky. It pressed down on her vast and indifferent. Callie adjusted the collar of her wool dress. It was her best dress, heavy and entirely inappropriate for the dry heat, but she needed to make a good impression. She needed to look like a wife. Callie. The voice was thick, scraped raw by dust. She turned. Amos Miller stood a few paces away. He matched the photograph he had mailed her, but the silver emulsion hadn't captured the hardness of his face. His skin was the texture of cured leather. His shoulders sloped beneath a faded cotton shirt worn thin by labor. He didn't take off his hat. His pale blue eyes swept over her, starting at the sensible boots she had polished the night before, traveling up the narrow line of her skirt, past her slender waist, stopping at her face. He frowned. It was a small movement, just a tightening of the muscles around his jaw, but Callie felt it like a physical blow. "Mr. Miller," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this moment 100 times in the cramped, airless boarding house, back east. "I am ready to work, Mr. Miller. I am ready to be a partner to you." Amos took a step closer, circling her slightly. He wasn't looking at a bride. He was inspecting livestock. "You didn't say you were so small," he murmured. It wasn't an accusation, just a blunt observation. Callie lifted her chin. She stood exactly 5 feet tall in her boots. She possessed wrists that looked delicate, collarbones that pressed sharply against her skin, and a frame that had always drawn pity from the matrons at the textile mill. But she had worked 14-hour shifts over looms that deafened men. She knew what her body could endure. "I am stronger than I look, Mr. Miller," she said. Amos sighed. He took off his hat and ran a calloused hand through thinning, sweat-damp hair. He looked out past the town toward the rolling foothills in the distance. "Miss Higgins, I ain't a cruel man," he started. The words were heavy. "But out here the land don't care about intentions. I run 50 head of cattle and a half-acre of potatoes on soil that fights me for every inch. Winter hits in 2 months. The snow gets waist-high. When the water pump freezes, I need a woman who can carry 2 heavy buckets from the creek uphill without breaking her back. I can learn." Callie insisted, her fingers tightening on the trunk's handle. Her knuckles turned stark white. "It ain't about learning." Amos looked back at her. The pity in his eyes was worse than the frown. "It's about bone, muscle. You got neither. You look like a strong gust of wind would snap you in half. If I take you out to my claim, you'll be dead by January. Or you'll get sick and I'll spend my winter nursing you instead of keeping my stock alive." Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. She had exactly $3 in her pocket. Her younger sisters back in Chicago were waiting for the first letter, the first few dollars she promised to send back, once she was settled as a married woman. There was no return ticket. There was nowhere to go. "Mr. Miller, please. We have an agreement." Letters were exchanged. "And I paid your fare out here," Amos interrupted softly. "Consider it a gift. Buy a ticket to Denver. Get a job in a hotel. You're pretty enough for city work. But you ain't built for a sod house in Wyoming." He didn't wait for her to cry. He didn't wait for her to argue. Amos Miller put his hat back on, tipped the brim, and turned his back on her. Callie watched him walk away. The dust kicked up by his boots settled back onto the road. He climbed into a battered wagon, flicked the reins over the back of a tired mule, and drove out of town. He never looked back. The train whistle shrieked a final mocking goodbye before the locomotive chugged out of the station, continuing west. Silence rushed in to fill the void. Callie stood on the platform alone. The sun began its slow descent, bleeding orange and bruised purple across the horizon. The heat of the day evaporated, replaced instantly by a creeping, biting chill. The wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the platform boards. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury for women who had someone to wipe their tears. Callie simply sank onto the hard wooden top of her trunk, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at the empty road. She would sit here until she figured out how to survive. Because dying, despite Amos Miller's prediction, simply wasn't on her schedule. Gerard Dixon smelled the town before he saw it. It was a sour mix of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and wood smoke that burned bitter. He hated Oak Haven. He hated the noise of it, the useless chatter of men who talked just to prove they were breathing. But salt ammunition and coffee couldn't be hunted or trapped. So twice a year he descended from the jagged peaks of the Tetons and tolerated civilization for exactly as long as it took to load his pack horse. He stood inside the mercantile, a massive shadow, blocking the light from the dusty front window. Gerard was a man carved from the landscape he inhabited, broad-shouldered, towering over 6 feet, with a thick beard and hair that hadn't seen shears since spring. He wore buckskin and heavy wool smelling faintly of pine resin and old blood. He placed 3 prime beaver pelts on the counter. Jeb the storekeeper adjusted his spectacles, his eyes darting nervously up to Gerard's face before dropping to the fur. Nobody made direct eye contact with Gerard Dixon. The town considered him half-savage, a ghost who only materialized to trade and vanished back into the timberline. "Good quality," Jeb muttered, running a thumb over the dense fur. "Reckon I can give you $10 credit or the equivalent in goods." "Goods," Gerard said. His voice was a low rumble. It scraped the back of his throat. Jeb nodded quickly, writing down a list as Gerard pointed to bags of flour sugar and heavy tins of coffee. As Jeb weighed the nails, he couldn't help but let his jaw run. "You see the spectacle at the depot today?" Jeb asked, not really expecting an answer. Amos Miller brought a mail-order bride all the way from Illinois, left her sitting right there on the platform. Jeb chuckled a dry, rattling sound, took one look at her and said she was too puny, sent her packing, except she ain't packed. She's just been sitting on her trunk for 5 hours. Gerard didn't care about Amos Miller. He didn't care about town gossip. He grabbed a sack of salt and hoisted it onto his shoulder. "Shame, really," Jeb babbled on. "Night's falling, temperatures dropping fast. Those drifters from the Bar K ranch have been eyeing her since sundown. Town ain't a safe place for a stray woman." Gerard paused. He looked out the grimy window. Down the street, illuminated by the flickering yellow light of the station master's lantern, was a small shape. From this distance, she looked like a child abandoned by her parents. She sat perfectly rigid on a large trunk. As Gerard watched, two men stumbled out of the saloon across from the depot. They were loud, their laughter carrying on the wind, stumbling over their own boots. They crossed the dirt road, heading straight for the platform. Gerard felt the familiar cold stillness settle over him. It was the same stillness that came when he watched a wolf circle a wounded fawn. It was none of his business. The affairs of the town belonged to the town. He turned back to the counter, gathering his remaining supplies. He walked out the front door, the bell jingling faintly. His pack-horse, tied to the rail, snorted in greeting. Gerard began lashing the sacks to the saddle. He tied the knots tight, his movements precise, and practiced. Down the street, a sharp voice cut through the wind. "I said step away from me." The voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a razor edge that carried. Gerard paused, his hand resting on the rough canvas of a flour sack. He looked down the street. The two drifters were on the platform now, bracketing the woman. One of them, a tall man with a slouch hat, was leaning in uncomfortably close, reaching for her arm. Gerard expected her to scream. He expected her to cower, to cry for help, to run. Instead, the woman stood up. She didn't retreat. She reached to her head, and in a flash of silver pulled a long, wicked-looking hatpin from her hair. She held it like a dagger, the point aimed directly at the tall man's throat. She didn't shake. Her posture was coiled, a cornered badger, ready to tear out an eye. "You touch me," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet night. "And I'll drive this through your windpipe before you can draw a breath." The drifters stopped. The tall man laughed, but it was an uncertain sound. He took a half-step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. Gerard watched from the shadows. The storekeeper had called her puny. Amos Miller had discarded her for being weak. But as Gerard looked at the rigid line of her spine, the defiant jut of her chin, he didn't see weakness. He saw survival. He saw the same quiet, desperate ferocity that kept things alive in the dead of winter. She wasn't too small. She was concentrated. Gerard finished tying the knot. He didn't need a wife. He had lived in the mountains alone for 6 years, speaking to nothing but the pines and the wind. But he had a cabin that leaked when the snow melted, a smokehouse that needed tending, and winter was coming with a vengeance. He unhitched his horse. He began walking toward the depot. Callie kept the hatpin level. Her arm was burning from the tension, and her heart was beating so violently she thought it might shatter her ribs. The two men, smelling of cheap liquor and unwashed denim, hesitated, but she could see the shift in their eyes. The surprise was wearing off, being replaced by cruel amusement. They were going to rush her. She braced her boots against the platform. Aim for the soft spot beneath the jaw, she told herself. Before the tall man could lunge, a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the street. The heavy tread of boots on the wooden stairs made the platform shudder. A man stepped into the circle of lantern light. Callie gasped, taking a reflexive step back. He was enormous. A mountain of dark wool and leather, a rifle slung casually over one shoulder, a hunting knife strapped to his thigh. His face was obscured by a thick beard, but his eyes caught the lantern light, dark, assessing, and utterly devoid of fear. The two drifters spun around. The tall man opened his mouth to bark a warning, but the words died in his throat. The giant didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his fists. He simply stood there, an immovable force of nature, and looked at the two men. It was a look that communicated a singular, undeniable truth. "If you stay here, you will die." The drifters exchanged a quick, panicked glance. Without a word, they backed away, turned and scurried off the platform, dissolving rapidly into the dark toward the saloon. Callie remained frozen, her hatpin still raised. She shifted her aim from the retreating drifters to the giant. He looked down at the silver pin in her hand. A faint, barely perceptible twitch occurred at the corner of his eye. It might have been amusement. "Put that away," he said. His voice was deep, scraping like rocks shifting in a riverbed. "Before you hurt yourself." "I know how to use it." Callie snapped, her voice trembling just slightly. "I saw." The man nodded slowly. He didn't move any closer. He gave her space and instinctual respect for a cornered animal. "But they're gone, and you're shivering." Callie realized he was right. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her violently aware of the biting wind slicing through her thin wool dress. Her teeth clicked together. She reluctantly lowered the hatpin, sliding it back into her disordered hair. She wrapped her arms around herself. "Thank you," she managed to say, her pride warring with her exhaustion. "But I don't have any money to pay you for your trouble." "Didn't ask for any." He looked past her at the horizon. "Amos Miller is a fool." Callie stiffened. "You know about that." "Whole town knows. Whole town's watching you freeze to death out of politeness." He finally looked directly at her. "Name is Gerard Dixon." Callie Higgins." "You got a place to go?" "Callie Higgins." "I'll figure something out. Town's closing up. No hotel here. Station master locks the depot in 10 minutes. You'll be sitting on the dirt." Gerard stated the facts without malice, just plain truth. Callie looked away, swallowing the hard lump of panic in her throat. "I'll sit on the dirt, then." "You'll freeze." "I'm tougher than I look." "I know." Gerard shifted his weight. "That's why I'm talking to you." Callie looked up at him, confused. "I live 3 days ride up the mountain," Gerard said, pointing a massive calloused finger toward the jagged black peaks looming in the distance against the night sky. "It's isolated. It's hard living. I trap. I hunt. But I got a leg that aches when the cold sets in, and I can't cure meat chop wood and run a trap line all at once before the first snow. I need a partner. Not a wife. A worker." Callie stared at him. "Amos Miller just told me I was too small to carry water." Amos Miller looks at the size of the dog. "I look at the size of the bite," Gerard replied evenly. "You stood down 2 drunk hands with a piece of wire. You got grit. I can use grit." "You want me to come to the mountains with you? A stranger?" "I'm offering a roof of fire and half the food we put up," Gerard said. "It's a business arrangement. You pull your weight, you survive the winter. Come spring when the pass is open. If you want to leave, I'll pay your stage fare to wherever you want to go." Callie studied his face. There was no warmth there, no charm, no false promises. Just raw, unvarnished pragmatism. He wasn't looking for a bedfellow. He was looking for a survival tactic. She looked back at the empty, dark street of Oakhaven. She looked at her trunk. She thought of Chicago, the suffocating factories, the poverty. There was nothing behind her. And sitting in front of her was a brutal winter, and a man who looked like he could wrestle a bear. "I don't know how to cure meat," Callie said, her voice tight. "I'll teach you. I eat a lot for my size. I hunt good." Callie took a deep breath. The wind howled, whipping her skirt around her ankles. The cold sank into her bones. She met Gerard Dixon's dark eyes. "Grab the other handle of the trunk," Callie said. Gerard didn't smile, but he stepped forward. He didn't grab the other handle. He simply bent down, hoisted the heavy leather trunk onto his shoulder, as if it were a bag of feathers, and started walking toward his horse. Callie watched his broad back for a second. She straightened her spine, smoothed her skirts, and stepped off the platform, following the mountain man into the dark. Gerard traded 2 prime fox pelts and his remaining credit at the livery for a sway-backed roan mare and a worn McClellan saddle. It wasn't a comfortable rig meant for cavalrymen with iron calluses, not a mill worker from Illinois. Callie didn't mention it. She hoisted herself up her heavy wool skirt, bunching awkwardly around her knees, and took the reins. They rode out of Oakhaven under the cover of darkness. The town vanished behind them, swallowed by the vast, indifferent prairie. By the dawn of the second day, the prairie surrendered to the foothills. The air grew thin and possessed a sharp, metallic bite that scraped Callie's lungs. The timberline swallowed them, replacing the open sky with ancient lodgepole pines that crowded the narrow trail. The silence here was heavy. It wasn't the empty silence of the train depot. It was an expectant hush, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting to see if these intruders would survive. Callie's body became a map of agony. The inside of her thighs rubbed raw against the stiff leather fenders of the saddle. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, relentless rhythm, the jolting of the trail compounding the exhaustion of the train ride. Her hands, unaccustomed to leather reins, and the bitter chill cracked at the knuckles, weeping tiny drops of blood. She did not make a sound. She rode behind Gerard, her eyes fixed on the broad expanse of his shoulders. He moved with a deceiving economy of motion, his large frame shifting seamlessly with his horse's gait. He rarely looked back. He didn't need to. He listened. He listened to the cadence of her mare's hooves, the rhythm of Callie's breathing, waiting for the inevitable moment she would ask to stop. The moment she would cry. The women from the settlements always cried when the mountain first bared its teeth, but the plea never came. At noon, Gerard halted beside a narrow, fast-running creek. He dismounted his left leg, stiff a subtle wince, tightening the corners of his eyes before he smoothed his expression. He unhooked a canvas canteen and walked back to her. Callie practically fell out of the saddle. Her legs buckled the moment her boots hit the uneven ground. She caught herself against the mare's flank, her chest heaving, fighting the black spots dancing in her vision. Gerard held out the canteen. He saw the blood dried on her knuckles. He saw the stark, ash-white pallor of her face, the dark smudges under her eyes. She looked like a strong wind would scatter her into dust. "Drink," he said. Callie took the canteen with trembling hands. The water was glacial, so cold it hurt her teeth, but she swallowed it greedily. "We can rest for 10 minutes." Gerard offered his voice, a low rumble over the rushing water. Callie wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve. "If I sit down, Mr. Dixon, I am not entirely certain I will be able to stand back up." "Gerard," she looked at him. "If we're going to share a winter, you can drop the Mr., he said. He took the canteen from her, his large fingers brushing the chilled skin of her wrist. He didn't linger. "And you don't have to prove anything. The mountain breaks everyone eventually. Best to bend before you snap." "I am not breaking," Callie said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I am simply assessing the damage. We have an arrangement. I intend to fulfill my end of it." Gerard stared at her. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a tin of hardened bear grease. He unscrewed the lid and handed it to her. "For your hands, and wherever else the saddle is biting. We ride until sundown." He turned away, giving her the privacy she needed. Callie watched his back, a sudden fierce knot of gratitude tightening in her throat. Amos Miller would have seen her trembling legs and sent her back. Gerard Dixon saw her trembling legs, handed her a remedy, and expected her to get back on the horse. It was a brutal kind of respect, but it was respect nonetheless. That night they camped on a rocky plateau. The wind howled through the granite spires above them, carrying the unmistakable scent of coming snow. Gerard built a fire efficiently, stripping dry bark and striking flint with practiced ease. The flames cast erratic, dancing shadows against the pines. He handed her a tin plate of salted pork and hardtack, soaked in boiling water. It tasted of ash and old grease. Callie ate every bite. My left femur was shattered 3 winters ago, Gerard said suddenly. Callie looked up. He was staring into the fire, a mug of black coffee cradled in his massive hands. It was the most he had spoken at one time since the depot. Timber fell wrong. Pinned me. I set it myself, but the bone healed crooked. He tapped his left thigh. When the cold drops below freezing, the marrow aches like a rotten tooth. I can hunt, I can shoot. But hauling a slaughtered elk 3 miles back to camp or chopping 2 cords of wood a week when the snow is waist deep. I move too slow. The cold catches me. Callie swallowed a piece of hardtack, letting the silence stretch before she answered. You need someone to do the heavy hauling, to manage the camp so you can focus on the meat. I need hands. Gerard agreed, his dark eyes shifting to hers. The firelight caught in them, illuminating a startling intelligence beneath the rugged exterior. I don't expect you to swing an axe like a lumberjack. I expect you to keep the fire from dying while I'm on the trap line. I expect you to salt the meat, smoke the hides, and keep the rot out of the root cellar. It's dirty, back-breaking work. You'll smell like blood and tallow until spring. I worked in a textile mill from the time I was 11, Callie said, her chin lifting. I know what a 14-hour shift feels like. I know how to mend canvas, how to stretch a pound of flour over a week, and how to ignore a blister until it calluses. You bring the meat, Gerard. I'll make sure we don't freeze. Gerard studied her across the flames. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Tomorrow we reach the ridge, he said, dumping the dregs of his coffee into the dirt. Get some sleep. The real work starts when we arrive. The cabin sat in a natural depression, carved into the side of the mountain, shielded from the worst of the northerly winds by a dense stand of ancient spruce. It was an ugly functional structure. Heavy unpeeled logs locked together with crude notches, the gaps packed tight with dried mud and sphagnum moss. The roof was sod sprouting dead yellow weeds. To Callie, it looked like a fortress. Gerard swung down from his horse, his bad leg taking the brunt of his weight. He hissed through his teeth a short, sharp sound before grabbing the reins of her mare. "We're here," he announced. Callie dismounted her boots, sinking into a thick layer of shed pine needles. The air here was drastically different from the valley. It was thin, painfully crisp, and utterly silent. The sheer isolation of the place struck her, then a physical weight pressing against her chest. If she screamed, nothing but the hawks would hear her. If Gerard Dixon decided to be a monster, there was nowhere to run. She looked at him. He was unlashing the heavy sacks of flour and salt from the pack horse, his jaw tight with the effort. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man trying to survive his own brokenness. Gerard pushed the heavy plank door open. It groaned on leather hinges. "Light the lantern on the table," he instructed, walking in with 100 pounds of supplies on his shoulder. Callie stepped inside. The interior was a single large room that smelled overwhelmingly of wood-smoke-tanned leather and stale sweat. It was dim, the only light filtering through a single oil paper window. A massive stone hearth dominated the far wall. A crude wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center. In one corner, a heavy bedstead was piled with furs. In the other, a mountain of traps, chains, and stretchers lay in an organized tangle. It was chaotic. It was filthy. It was hers to fix. Callie found the lantern, struck a match from a tin box, and lit the wick. The yellow glow pushed back the shadows, revealing layers of soot and neglect. Gerard dropped the sacks in the corner with a heavy thud. He stood up, stretching his back, and looked around, as if seeing the mess for the first time through her eyes. He cleared his throat, suddenly looking awkward. "I ain't much for housekeeping," he muttered. "Spend most of my time outside." "I can see that," Callie said. She didn't sound disgusted. She sounded calculating. She walked over to the hearth, inspecting the heavy iron pot hanging from a swivel arm. It was caked in old grease. She looked at the floor, packed dirt, covered in a layer of ash and discarded wood chips. "Where is the water?" she asked. Gerard pointed a thumb toward the door. "Creek is about 50 yards behind the cabin. There's 2 wooden buckets on the porch." Callie unpinned her hat, setting it carefully on the table. She unbuttoned the cuffs of her heavy wool dress and rolled them up past her elbows, exposing pale, slender forearms. "You're tired," Gerard said, a frown creasing his forehead. "You've been in the saddle for 3 days. Sit down. I'll fetch the water and start a fire. You have a limp, Gerard. Your leg is throbbing and we both know it." Callie replied evenly, not looking at him as she walked toward the door. "You need to chop wood before it gets dark. We need heat. I will fetch the water. I will scrub this pot, and I will make us something that doesn't taste like shoe leather for supper." Gerard stood frozen in the center of the cabin. No one gave him orders. Not ever. Men in town avoided him. Trappers gave him a wide berth. Callie stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. Her small frame was silhouetted against the fading grey light of the afternoon. "We have an arrangement," she reminded him softly. "You hunt, I keep the rot out. Allow me to do my job so you can do yours." She stepped out onto the porch. Gerard let out a slow, heavy breath. A strange sensation tightened his chest, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Relief. He walked over to the corner, grabbed his heavy splitting axe, and headed out to the woodpile. For the next 2 hours they worked, in a silent, perfectly synchronized orbit. The rhythmic, echoing thwack of Gerard's axe, splitting pine logs, served as the metronome. Inside, Callie became a whirlwind of motion. She carried buckets of freezing creek water, her shoulders screaming in protest. But she didn't stop. She boiled the water, scrubbing the iron pot with sand and pine needles until the metal shone dull grey. She swept the packed dirt floor with a broom made of bound twigs. By the time Gerard carried the last armful of split wood into the cabin, night had fully descended. The temperature plummeted a bitter cold, pressing against the log walls. But inside, the change was profound. A fire roared in the clean hearth, throwing intense heat into the room. The soot had been wiped from the table, and a smell rich and savoury filled the air. Gerard dropped the wood into the heavy iron cradle beside the fire. He dusted off his hands, staring at the pot bubbling over the flames. "Found a sack of dried beans and an onion in your root cellar," Callie said, standing by the fire. She looked exhausted, her hair falling from its pins, a smudge of ash across her cheek. But her eyes were bright. "Slice the rest of the salted pork. It's a stew. Or as close to a stew as I can manage with what we have." Gerard walked over to the table and sat down in one of the heavy wooden chairs. His bad leg stretched out stiffly in front of him, the heat of the fire sinking into the aching bone. Callie brought over 2 tin bowls, setting them down. She handed him a spoon. Gerard took a bite. The pork was tough, and the beans were slightly undercooked, but the broth was rich and salty and warm. It was the best thing he had eaten in 6 months. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just ate methodically, clearing his bowl. Callie sat across from him, eating slowly, watching the flames. "You didn't cry on the trail," Gerard said, finally breaking the quiet. Crying wouldn't have made the horse walk any faster. Gerard set his spoon down. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Beneath the soot and the exhaustion, he saw the iron in her spine. Amos Miller was a blind fool. "Winter hits hard up here, Callie," he said, his voice stripped of its usual gruffness. It was a warning, but also an acknowledgement. "The snow will trap us in this cabin for weeks at a time. The cold makes people crazy, makes them mean. We'll be on top of each other. It won't be easy. Callie met his gaze. She didn't flinch. I survived a boarding house with 20 other desperate women of foremen who liked to use his fists and a train ride that cost me my pride. I am not afraid of Snow Gerard, and I am not afraid of you. Gerard's mouth twitched. It was a fraction of an inch the closest thing to a smile his face had managed in years. Good, he said quietly. He stood up, taking his empty bowl to the wash basin. Tomorrow I show you how to skin a hare. The blood was hot. It steamed in the freezing morning air, carrying a sharp metallic odor that coated the back of Callie's throat. She held the dead hare by its hind legs. Gerard stood beside her, his breath pluming in the cold. He handed her a short, bone-handled knife. The blade was honed to a razor's edge. Don't saw, Gerard instructed, his voice flat. Slice. Let the edge do the work. Start at the heel, cut down the inside of the leg to the vent. Keep the blade shallow. You pierce the bowels, you ruin the meat. Callie swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She had gutted fish in Chicago, small silver things that barely bled. This was different. This was visceral. She pressed the blade against the hare's soft belly fur. Her hand shook. Gerard didn't offer to do it for her. He simply watched a silent monolith, waiting for her to either break or adapt. Callie gripped the handle tighter. She forced her breathing to slow. She made the cut. It was sloppy at first, the skin tearing unevenly, but she adjusted her angle. She pulled the hide away from the muscle, the connective tissue giving way with a sickening wet, tearing sound. By the time she finished, her apron was stained crimson and her fingers were slick with gore. She dropped the ruined pelt into a wooden bucket and handed the dressed meat to Gerard. Messy, was all he said. But the meat is clean. You'll do better on the next one. There were many next ones. September bled into October, a relentless, grinding cycle of preparation. The mountain didn't care about fatigue. It demanded a toll paid in sweat and animal fat. Gerard hunted every day, leaving before dawn and returning at dusk, his pack horse loaded down with elk deer and dozens of rabbits. Callie became a butcher. Her hands, once soft and prone to blistering, developed thick yellow calluses. Dirt permanently stained the creases of her knuckles. The smell of rendering tallow and wood smoke seeped into her skin, entirely replacing the faint scent of the lavender soap she had brought from the city. She learned to strip sinew and dry it for thread. She learned to pack meat in layers of salt, wedging it tightly into the wooden barrels lining the root cellar. She learned that boiling hickory bark produced a bitter tea that warded off the stomach rot of a meat-heavy diet. They moved around each other in the small cabin like gears in a clock. There was no romance. There were barely any conversations that didn't revolve around firewood-salt ratios or incoming weather. Yet a silent, profound understanding began to take root in the dirt floor of their shared existence. One late October evening, Gerard returned, dragging the hindquarters of a massive bull elk. He was limping badly. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees since noon, and the damp chill was visibly chewing at his shattered femur. His face was grey, slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with exertion. He dropped the meat on the processing table outside and braced his hands on the frozen wood, his head hanging between his shoulders. His breathing was ragged. Callie walked out of the cabin, holding a bucket of boiling water. She took one look at his ashen face, the tight line of his jaw, and the way his left leg trembled uncontrollably. "Go inside," she said. Gerard didn't look up. "Meat needs breaking down. The wolves will smell it before morning." "I know how to break it down. You showed me on the doe last week." "An elk isn't a doe, Callie. The joints are heavy. You don't have the leverage to snap the bone." He pushed himself off the table, grimacing, as his weight shifted. He reached for his meat cleaver. Callie stepped between him and the table. She was a foot shorter and weighed half of what he did. But she stood her ground. "Gerard Dixon, you are a stubborn fool," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its usual polite cadence. "If you snap that bad leg out here in the dark, I cannot carry you inside. You will freeze to death in the dirt, and I will be left alone to starve. Go. Inside." Gerard stared down at her. His eyes were dark, clouded with pain, and a flicker of raw surprise. He opened his mouth to argue to reassert control, but the agony radiating from his hip cut his breath short. He looked at the massive slab of muscle and bone on the table, then down at Callie's determined, soot-stained face. He dropped the cleaver. It thudded onto the chopping block. Without a word, he turned and limped heavily into the cabin. Callie stood alone in the freezing dark. The wind whipped her skirts around her ankles, biting through her wool coat. She looked at the elk quarter. It was huge. Amos Miller's voice echoed in the back of her mind. Too small. She picked up the cleaver. It was heavy, the iron grip freezing against her palm. She found the joint just as Gerard had taught her. She didn't try to muscle it apart. She used the table for leverage, shifting the meat, finding the exact angle of the bone, and brought the cleaver down with a sharp, precise strike. The joint separated with a wet crack. It took her 3 hours. By the time she carried the last heavy pan of salted cuts into the root cellar, her arms were trembling so violently she could barely turn the iron latch on the door. When she finally walked into the cabin, Gerard was sitting in the chair by the hearth. The fire was blazing. He was awake, watching her. Callie walked to the wash basin, ignoring his gaze. She scrubbed the drying blood from her arms with freezing water and rough lye soap, her teeth chattering. "There's a tin cup on the stones," Gerard said quietly. Callie paused. She looked at the hearth. A mug sat dangerously close to the flames, steaming. She walked over and picked it up. It was willow bark tea, steeped dark and bitter. Gerard usually drank it for his pain. She looked at him. He didn't say thank you. He didn't offer apologies. But as she drank the scalding, bitter liquid, the warmth seeping back into her frozen chest, the transaction between them shifted. She hadn't just proven her worth. She had covered his weakness, and in the mountains that was a debt heavier than gold. November arrived not with a whisper, but with a howl. The sky turned a bruised uniform grey, and the snow began to fall. It wasn't the picturesque drifting snow of a Chicago winter. It was a violent horizontal assault. The wind roared off the peaks like a physical entity, slamming into the cabin with enough force to make the heavy logs groan. For 3 days and 3 nights, it didn't stop. When the wind finally died, the world was gone. The creek was buried. The woodpile was a smooth, white mound. The snow was packed 4 feet high against the cabin door. They were trapped. Cabin fever is a quiet madness. It starts in the corners of the room, a creeping sense of claustrophobia that makes the air feel thick and every sound agonizingly loud. The cabin, which had seemed large enough when they were outside from dawn to dusk, suddenly shrank. They existed in 10 square feet of usable space around the hearth. The cold was absolute. The fire, eating through a cord of wood a week, barely pushed the frost back from the walls. The damp earth of the floor froze solid, and Gerard's leg surrendered. The deep, penetrating cold gnawed at the crookedly healed bone until he could no longer stand. He spent his days in the heavy chair by the fire, his leg propped on a wooden crate, his face a tight mask of stoic endurance. He whittled chunks of pine into kindling with vicious, jerky motions, the only outlet for his frustration. Callie took over. She became the engine keeping them alive. Every morning she bundled herself in 3 layers of wool, wrapping a heavy canvas tarp around her shoulders. She forced the cabin door open, shoving against the compacted snow with all her meager weight. Digging out the woodpile was an agony of ice and burning lungs. Hauling the heavy frozen logs back inside took hours of methodical, exhausting labor. She couldn't carry 3 logs at once like Gerard. She dragged them one by one, using a rope she rigged into a makeshift harness. One brutally cold morning, the water barrel inside ran dry. Callie strapped on a pair of oversized snowshoes Gerard had woven from gut and ash wood. She grabbed the heavy iron axe and 2 wooden buckets, stepping out into the blinding white expanse. The snow was thigh-deep and powdery. Every step was a battle. She reached the creek entirely buried beneath a thick shelf of ice. She knelt her knees, sinking into the freezing powder, and swung the axe. The iron bounced off the ice, jarring her shoulders so hard her teeth clicked together. She adjusted her grip. She remembered the elk joint. Don't use muscle. Use angle. She chipped away, swinging methodically, ignoring the burning tear in her rotator cuff. When the ice finally cracked, dark, freezing water welled up. She filled the buckets. Carrying them back was worse. The water sloshed freezing instantly against her wool skirt, turning it into a rigid bell of ice that scraped against her shins. She fell twice. The second time, the snow swallowed her up to her chest. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her throat. The cabin looked a mile away. It would be so easy to just stay down. The snow was almost warm. "You are a strong gust of wind, Callie," she heard Amos Miller's voice. She gritted her teeth, a snarl escaping her chapped lips. She shoved her frozen mittens into the snow, pushed herself upright, grabbed the bucket handles, and kept walking. When she finally pushed through the cabin door, she collapsed. The buckets hit the dirt floor, splashing freezing water over her boots. Gerard was out of his chair. He had dragged himself across the floor, leaning heavily on a crutch he had fashioned from a straight pine branch. He reached her just as she hit the ground. He didn't speak. He grabbed her by the shoulders of her frozen canvas wrap and hauled her up, practically carrying her to the hearth. He stripped the frozen tarp off her, unwound the ice-caked scarf from her neck, and pushed her down onto the pile of furs on his bed. "You're blue," he said. His voice was hoarse. It wasn't the gruff rumble she was used to. It was threaded with a fear he couldn't quite hide. "Water's inside." Callie mumbled, her jaw trembling violently. "Damn the water!" Gerard grabbed a rough wool blanket and wrapped it tightly around her. He pulled his heavy chair closer to the bed, trapping the heat from the fire around her. He didn't go back to his corner. He sat beside her, his massive frame a shield against the freezing drafts leaking through the cabin walls. He took her hands. She couldn't feel her fingers. They were white, stiff as wood. Gerard clamped them between his 2 massive calloused palms, rubbing them briskly, sharing his body heat. "I told you," Callie whispered, her teeth clattering. "I wouldn't break." Gerard looked down at her hands. The soft city girl who had sat on the train depot platform was gone. Her knuckles were split, her skin scarred by knives and frost. She was small. She was fragile. But as he looked at the sheer defiance burning in her exhausted eyes, he knew he was looking at the strongest creature on the mountain. "You didn't break," Gerard agreed softly. He stopped rubbing her hands and simply held them, his thumbs pressing against her ruined knuckles. "You held us together." He didn't let go. And for the first time since she stepped off the train in Wyoming, Callie didn't feel cold. Spring did not arrive with blooming flowers or singing birds. It arrived as a violent thaw. The ice crusting the cabin roof cracked like a pistol shot in the middle of the night. The snowpack, which had entombed them for 4 months, began to rot, turning into a grey, slushy morass that leaked through the mud-chinked walls. The creek roared back to life, swelling its banks and tearing down ancient pines in a torrent of muddy water. It was ugly. It was wet. And it was the most beautiful thing Callie had ever seen. She stood on the small porch, breathing in the scent of wet soil and decaying leaves. The air no longer burned her lungs. It felt heavy, laden with the promise of survival. Beside her, Gerard leaned on the porch rail. He wasn't using the crutch. The deep, marrow-freezing ache in his leg had receded with the frost, leaving behind a manageable limp. He watched the tree line his eyes, tracking a pair of eagles circling the warming thermals. His beard was shaggy, his hair brushing his shoulders, and his buckskins hung looser on his frame. The winter had stripped them both of any excess. They were lean, hardened, and alive. "Pass will be clear in 2 weeks," Gerard said. He didn't look at her. Callie wiped her hands on her stained apron. "We need flour. The salt is nearly gone, and the roof needs new pitch before the spring rains set in." Gerard nodded slowly. He pushed off the rail. "I'll start bundling the pelts. We ride down on Monday." The journey back to Oakhaven took 4 days. The trail was a treacherous ribbon of slick mud and washed-out ravines. Callie rode the sway-backed mare, but she didn't sit like the terrified city girl from August. She rode with an easy, relaxed posture, anticipating the horse's shifts, her balance honed by months of hauling wood and butchering meat on uneven ground. She wore a coat Gerard had fashioned from a wolf pelt, and her hands resting on the reins were bare, exposing the thick yellow calluses and white scars that told the story of her winter. Oakhaven hadn't changed. It was still a dusty collection of false front buildings, desperate men and wind. As they rode down the main thoroughfare, the town stopped. Men on the boardwalk paused mid-step. The saloon doors ceased their swinging. Jeb the storekeeper was sweeping the boardwalk outside his mercantile. He froze the broom, hovering inches above the dirt. Everyone recognized Gerard Dixon. But the woman riding beside him, her spine straight her chin, lifted her eyes, scanning the street with the flat, assessing gaze of a predator they didn't know her. Not at first. Gerard dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. He didn't offer a hand to Callie. He knew she didn't need it. She swung down smoothly her boots, hitting the dry dust with a solid thud. They walked into the mercantile. The bell jingled unnaturally loud in the quiet store. Jeb scrambled behind the counter. "Mr. Dixon!" He stammered, his eyes darting to Callie. Recognition finally breached his confusion. His mouth dropped open. Miss Higgins, 50 pounds of flour. Jeb!" Gerard rumbled, ignoring the storekeeper's shock. He dropped 2 massive bundles of prime winter pelts onto the counter. 10 pounds of salt, a new iron wedge for splitting, and coffee. Callie wandered down the narrow aisle, inspecting the canned goods. She felt the stares from the street through the dusty window, but she didn't care. She was looking for dried apples. The lack of fruit had made her gums bleed in February. "Callie." The voice was thin, scraped raw by dust. Callie turned. Standing at the end of the aisle, holding a burlap sack of seed potatoes, was Amos Miller. He looked exactly the same. The faded cotton shirt, the sloped shoulders, the tired pale blue eyes beneath the brim of a worn hat. But something fundamental had shifted. When Callie looked at him now, she didn't see a terrifying judge who held her fate in his hands. She saw a tired, unimaginative man holding a bag of dirt-covered tubers. He didn't look threatening. He looked small. Amos stared at her. His eyes flicked from the scarred leather of her boots to the heavy wolf fur coat landing on her face. Her skin was tanned dark by snow glare, a thin, jagged scar cutting through her left eyebrow, where a piece of flying firewood had caught her in January. She looked wild. She looked formidable. "I heard you went up the mountain with the trapper," Amos said. His voice wavered. "Town figured you were dead by Christmas." "Town figured wrong, Mr. Miller," Callie said evenly. She reached past him, entirely unbothered by his proximity, and grabbed a tin of dried apples from the shelf. "You look—" Amos struggled for the word. He looked at her scarred, thick-knuckled hands. "You look hard used." "I am alive," Callie corrected him, "which is more than I would be if I had stayed on that platform." Amos shifted his weight, his pride stinging. "I did you a kindness. I told you I wasn't a cruel man. I saved you from a winter on a sod claim you weren't built for." Callie stopped. She turned fully to face him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The quiet gravity of her presence filled the narrow aisle. "You did me no kindness, Amos. You looked at the shape of my bones and decided I had no iron in my blood. You discarded me because it was easy." Callie stepped closer. Amos instinctively took a step back. "I spent the winter chopping ice. I butchered elk. I dug a man out of a blizzard and kept a fire burning when the temperature dropped so low the trees exploded. Do not ever presume to tell me what I am built for." Amos swallowed hard. He looked away, unable to hold her gaze. He clutched his bag of seed potatoes, edged past her, and hurried toward the front of the store. He paid Jeb without haggling and practically ran out the door. Callie watched him go. There was no triumph in her chest, just a quiet, settled peace. The ghost that had haunted her from the train depot was finally dead. She walked up to the counter and set the tin of apples down next to the pelts. Gerard was watching her. He had heard every word. His dark eyes were unreadable, but the tight set of his jaw had softened. He looked at Jeb, who was furiously calculating the value of the furs, sweating under Gerard's silent gaze. "Keep the total running, Jeb," Gerard said. He reached inside his heavy buckskin coat. The afternoon sun sat low, casting long golden shadows across the dusty street of Oakhaven. Gerard finished loading the last sack of flour onto the pack horse. He secured the rope with a tight diamond hitch, his movements deliberate and slow. Callie stood by her mare, adjusting the stirrup leathers. The air between them was thick, heavy, with the weight of an unspoken deadline. Gerard turned to face her. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. It clinked with the distinct sound of gold eagles. He held it out to her. Callie looked at the pouch, then up at his face. His expression was a stone wall. It was the same stoic mask he wore when he set a broken bone or gutted an animal. A mask built to survive pain. "What is this?" Callie asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. $60, Gerard replied. His voice scraped the back of his throat. "It's your half of the winter fur yield. More than enough for a stage ticket to Denver and train fare back to Chicago, with enough left over to set yourself up in a decent boarding house." Callie didn't take the pouch. "I didn't ask for money. We had an arrangement," Gerard stated, quoting his own words from the depot platform 8 months ago. "You pull your weight, you survive the winter. Come spring, when the pass is open, I pay your fare to wherever you want to go. You pulled your weight. The debt is paid." He pushed the pouch closer to her chest. Callie looked at the worn leather. It represented everything she had wanted when she first stepped off that train. Safety. A return to the familiar. An escape from the brutal, unforgiving edge of the world. She looked past Gerard's shoulder, up toward the jagged black peaks of the Tetons rising against the sky. She thought of the tiny smoky cabin. She thought of the smell of pine resin, the taste of bitter willow bark tea, and the agonizing cold. Then she looked at Gerard. She saw the way he shifted his weight to spare his bad leg. She saw the calluses on his massive hands that had rubbed the frostbite from her fingers and dragged her out of the snow. She saw a man who had never once pitied her, never once underestimated her, and who was now breaking his own heart just to keep a promise. Chicago was a prison of smog and noise. Denver was just another town full of men who talked too much. Her home wasn't a place. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of an axe in the distance. It was the shared silence by a roaring hearth. Callie reached out. She didn't take the pouch. She wrapped her scarred, rough hands around Gerard's massive, calloused fingers, pushing the gold back toward his chest. "The roof needs pitch," Callie said softly. Gerard froze. He stared down at her hands, holding his. "Callie, the root cellar is empty, and the bears will be waking up hungry." She continued, her gaze locking onto his. "And you still refuse to slice the salt pork thin enough to fry properly." Gerard's chest rose and fell in a jagged breath. The stone mask fractured. The intense, raw vulnerability that bled into his dark eyes was blinding. He looked at her, as if she had just pulled him from drowning. "It's a hard life, Callie. It doesn't get easier next winter, or the one after that. I am not looking for easy," she said. She stepped into his space, the distance between them evaporating. "I am looking for a partner. Someone who sees the iron. I found him." She let go of his hands, turned, and walked back into the mercantile. Gerard stood frozen in the street for a long 3 seconds. He looked at the leather pouch in his hand. A slow, profound realization washed over him, settling deep into his bones, warmer than any fire they had built that winter. He put the money back in his coat. When Callie emerged from the store a few minutes later, she was dragging a massive burlap sack of winter wheat seed that weighed nearly 50 pounds. She lugged it across the boardwalk and let it drop into the dust by Gerard's boots with a heavy thud. She dusted off her hands, looking up at the towering mountain man with a fierce, challenging spark in her eyes. "I need you to lift this onto the pack horse, Gerard," she said, a small, knowing smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "It's far too heavy for a woman my size." Gerard let out a sound. It started low in his chest, rumbling up through his throat until it broke the quiet of the evening air. It was a laugh, rich, deep, and entirely unpracticed. He bent down, hoisted the heavy sack onto his shoulder with one arm and secured it to the horse. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply untied Callie's mare, handed her the reins, and walked beside her as they turned their backs onto the town, heading up the long, muddy trail toward the timberline. Heading home. If this gritty tale of survival and unexpected love on the frontier struck a chord with you, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a real hard-earned Western romance. Subscribing to the channel ensures you never miss out on our upcoming historical dramas and frontier storytelling. We pour our hearts into bringing the Wild West to life, and your support keeps the campfire burning. Drop a comment below. Would you have survived the winter with Gerard? Like, share,